The new Panasonic Lumix S9 is here, and at a price of only $1,500, this camera packs a lot of capabilities into a very compact body. But in my opinion, due to a maximum recording time limit of only 15 minutes and the lack of a headphone jack, this camera does not hit the baseline that's required for any new video camera if you're going to use it for professional work. So it's hard for me to recommend the S9 if you want to use it to film weddings or corporate or commercial videos or even YouTube videos. That said, if you are brand new to filmmaking in general and you know that you're not going to hit this 15-minute recording limit and you're wanting a fun compact camera that will help you get into the Lumix ecosystem of cameras with an affordable option that's still quite powerful, that's where I think the S9 starts to make sense. Spoiler for how I film about this camera because I respect your time. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing this camera from the perspective of a wedding/professional filmmaker. But I am going to be also considering how well it would be for you if you used it as a brand new filmmaker too. Also, for the sake of ethics, I want you to know this video is not paid or sponsored by Panasonic, but they did fly me out to Japan to see the launch of this camera, which is why there's a nice hotel room background for this video. Also, this camera is on loan from Panasonic and I plan on giving it back to them whenever they ask for it. Anyways, let's get started by talking about the build and the overall size of this camera because I feel like Lumix really created a beautiful camera here. It's full frame, but it's small. Look, it's just compact, fits into your hand really easily. And if I'm allowed to say this, it feels a little bit reminiscent of a Leica. Don't get mad at me for saying that, okay? Just, kind of looks like clean, maybe that's just me, okay? Maybe I'm crazy. Also, emphasizing the size here for a second. In the past, Lumix has always made cameras that I would consider, in a word, chunky. Could be a term that you could use for it. I remember even the Micro Four Thirds Panasonic GH5 that I reviewed back in 2017. Wow, it has been a while. That camera was quite hefty compared to my full frame A7S II. But that said, it did have great ergonomics and no overheating issues, so that's a win. But with the S9, this is different because this is a quite compact camera and it's nice to see from Lumix. Buttons-wise though, this is where it gets interesting because as with other most small cameras, there's not much room to put buttons on it. But what I want to draw your attention to is not necessarily what is lacking on the S9, but what has been included. What's lacking first though? I can't help but wish that this camera had an extra dial on it. You have one on the top here, you have one on the back, but I really would like another one right here in the front. I feel like my finger could just go so perfectly right there and spin something. And I'm really not a fan of the back dial being needed to adjust the shutter speed because there's always a chance you're gonna bump this here. I maybe film something, kind of bump it. Oh crap, I just changed my shutter speed. So whenever I'm filming with any camera, I prefer to leave this dial as non-active unless I press a button and then I adjust it. That's just me personally though. Anyways though, let's talk about what has been included because this is where this camera starts to get really fascinating. First off, I'm glad to see that Lumix has added a nice big red record button here, emphasizing that they care about video recording, which I do too, so that's really great to see. Of course, you can reprogram this button if you want. But let's look at the back of the camera now because you have a lot of buttons that are typical for Panasonic cameras, right? You got your ISO, Q for quality settings, you got a trash can, it's all pretty common, right? Look up here at the top and you have an AF on switch, typical. But then next to it, what is this? A LUT button. LUTs? Yes, really. So this camera does support LUTs like most new cameras do, but Panasonic has seen fit to include a dedicated LUT button on this camera. And the reason for it is actually super cool and really compelling for the future of Lumix cameras. So let's talk about it. Why did they feel the need to include a LUT button? Well, it all comes down to the level of customizability that Lumix wanted to offer with the S9. They know that many filmmakers use LUTs, so they've really created an entire ecosystem around enabling you to create, modify, and add your own LUTs to this camera, and it's super cool. Here's how it works. First, you have the S9, which supports up to 39 different custom LUTs inside it, and there are a few that come pre-installed. Any LUT that you install can be heavily customized in camera as well, with you having the option to adjust the opacity of the LUT if it's too intense. And here's where it gets really crazy. You can actually apply 2 different LUTs at the same time. Here's an example why this is so powerful. Imagine that you wanted to add a conversion LUT that you prefer to use. So you can convert the camera from filming in Vlog to Rec 709 in camera. And then you also want to add a creative LUT on top of that to adjust the look of your footage. Well, you can now add 2 LUTs with this camera and combine them and then adjust the opacity and intensity for each of them. It's awesome. And I don't know if any other camera manufacturer allowing you to do that, even on like a high-end cinema camera. We also need to talk about the app. There's an app, of course there's an app. Do you know what year it is? There's an app for everything, okay? Including a new app for this camera. It's called Lumix Lab. I like the alliteration there. And this app is the coolest in my opinion because it enables you to create custom LUTs that you can then seamlessly transfer to your camera. So you can literally customize a preview with sliders to control the contrast and saturation and exact colors that you want on your phone, and then transfer that as a LUT to your camera. It's pretty wild. Now, are you starting to catch on why Lumix added a dedicated LUT button to the S9? Because with it, you can press this button and then immediately access any of your up to 39 saved LUTs. There are plenty of camera manufacturers that have gone halfway with this, allowing you to copy LUTs to your camera, but none of them have either this simple to use wireless transfer from your phone to your camera, and definitely none of them have the level of LUT customization that you're getting with the S9. So I think this is really exciting, even if you do not love all of the other features of this camera, or you're upset about some of the missing features of it, which we're going to talk about very soon. This is still a very interesting preview of what Panasonic has coming down the pipeline. And for future cameras, I would love to see this capability. I don't know if they necessarily need to have a dedicated LUT button, but the option to be able to go into a menu and add and customize LUTs is something that I would love to see on every single camera from every single manufacturer. It's a no-brainer, right? Also, while we're talking about LUTs for a second, I want you to know that I've created a set of LUTs that work fantastic with this camera. I will link to them down in the video description if you want to check them out. Anyways, let's talk about other features of the S9 that aren't necessarily new, but are really impressive to see in such a compact form factor at this price point. The first thing you need to know is that the S9 is essentially a stripped down S5 Mark II that Panasonic has removed features from to hit a cheaper $1,500 price point. And if you've used an S5 II, you know that's a very capable camera, and here's what the S9 has brought over from it. First off, you get, as I've talked about earlier, a full frame sensor, which is fantastic to see in such a compact body. This sensor is capable of recording everything anywhere from full HD at up to 120 frames per second, all the way up to 6K resolution at up to 30 frames per second in open gate, which is really impressive. If you don't know what open gate is, it's an aspect ratio with a much higher vertical amount of information than your typical 16:9 frame. The camera is capable of using the full height and width of the sensor to record video, which essentially gives you the ability to very easily reframe your video when editing. If you're exporting in 4K, you can reframe your video with a lot more information at the top and bottom of the screen, but where open gate really shines is if you need to film your video in vertical as well as horizontal resolution. With a non-open gate camera, you need to essentially film a clip horizontally and then turn your camera vertically to film things vertically as well in a completely different shot. But with an open gate sensor, because you're recording a lot more vertical information, you can much more easily crop your horizontal video and make it vertical, and this just makes everything easier overall. I really want to see all camera manufacturers adopt open gate format recording in the future. I'm looking at you in particular, Sony. Anyways, back to frame rates and resolutions. If there's one con that the S9 has inherited from the S5 II, that is in the area of a crop. Because whenever you record in 4K at 60 frames per second, you have a 1.5 times crop that brings the sensor down to an APS-C size. Unfortunately, I do not see this changing until the S9 Mark II is released at some point in the future. But I will say that in terms of that baseline that I mentioned earlier that I want new cameras to hit, recording full frame 4K 60 is something that I really think is the minimum that most cameras should be striving for in this day and age. Speaking of sensor capabilities, by the way, I also want you to know that in my rolling shutter test, which was super scientific and consisted of me pointing my camera out a window of a bus while riding down the highway at high speed, I noticed a pretty large amount of rolling shutter, which, hey, I realize that it is a 6K image that's being recorded in a very compact body, but what I want you to be aware of is that you may end up seeing some rolling shutter, especially if you whip your camera back and forth or you're filming out the window on a highway like me. Sensor talk out of the way and talking autofocus here for a second, I want you to know that Panasonic has put the same autofocus system from the S5 II into this camera, and that's a really good autofocus system. So for the most part, I found it to be very accurate at tracking and keeping hold on me as I was filming myself and other people. I did notice that one or two times it lost it, so I don't think that the autofocus system is quite as rock solid as a Sony autofocus system, but it's still very usable and light years ahead of the last time that I used a autofocus system from the Panasonic, which was the GH5. contrast-based. It was pretty rough. What else do we get with the S9 that I love? We get Panasonic's legendary in-body image stabilization. You know it's good. You know it's incredible. I'm sure you've seen other tests of it online. It's, in a word, fantastic. And while you don't need to completely get rid of your gimbal, if you need to film some handheld stuff, this is a great camera to do it with. And considering how small this camera is, I was really impressed that they were able to get that level of image stabilization in it. Panasonic has also introduced another very new cool feature into the S9 that is called hybrid zoom. If you ever used clear image zoom on a Sony camera, this is going to sound familiar to you, but I actually really love how Panasonic has implemented this more than Sony, and it's super cool to see. Hybrid zoom is essentially a very high quality digital zoom that you can enable on the S9 that will work in tandem with a normal zoom lens. So for example, with a Sony camera like the a7S III for example, you can zoom your camera lens all the way in, and then you have to press a button to enable clear image zoom, or if your lens has a zoom rocker, you can use that to zoom in closer, or if it has a zoom rocker on the camera like the FX3, that will also enable you to zoom in closer. But with the S9, the way that Panasonic has implemented this zoom feature is super intuitive, and I really, really love it. So the way that it works is that it works in tandem with a zoom lens. So whenever you put a zoom lens on the camera and you start rotating the zoom to zoom in, if it's turned off, your lens is going to zoom in normally. But if it is enabled, as you zoom in the lens, the camera is also going to start to digitally zoom in the image as well and give you a lot more focal length and range. And it is really smooth as it does it, and it's super impressive to see. What's great too is that with this feature enabled, you don't have to think about it anymore. It's just going to work automatically out of the box. You don't have to think, did I turn on the digital zoom? No, it's already there and it's just working. Now, as far as quality loss goes, whenever using this hybrid zoom feature, I unfortunately have not had time to do any sort of in-depth pixel peeping where I'm digging in to look exactly if there's any sort of image quality loss. But in my rough, just looking at it on my computer screen, I think the quality still looks really good. The main thing that I would keep in mind is that if this is anything like Sony's clear image zoom, as long as you have a lot of light, you're gonna be fine. It's just whenever you start to crank the ISO, the camera's gonna be digitally zooming in on that noise that you've created, and that can really make the image unusable. Anyways, talking about unusable, that's a good segue into talking about some of the cons of this camera. Because yes, while it does have many of the same capabilities as the S5 II, it is also lacking many of those features as well. And this is where I want to turn back to my initial statement that I made at the beginning of this review, where I said that I don't feel like this camera hits the baseline that is required for any new video camera that's ready to be used by professionals. So if you are a wedding filmmaker or commercial filmmaker and you are brand new and you're looking for an affordable camera and you see the price tag for this one, you're thinking, okay, well that could work well and that's going to get me into the L-mount lens system, which is really good and growing and getting better all the time. Or maybe you're not brand new, but you're looking for a B or C camera that you could use at a wedding or to film an extra angle for interviews, and you're like, dang, only $1,500, maybe I should get this thing, right? Well, this is where you need to listen up and pay attention to this part of this video. First of all, let's get the easy cons out of the way. And as I'm talking about all this, I want you to remember $1,500 camera, okay? Price-wise. Just keep that in the back of your mind, because I've had to keep that in the back of my mind as I've been working through this video and spending time with this camera. Number one, now, this camera does not have a headphone jack. If you look over on the side, it has a microphone jack, which is great to see, so you can plug in a microphone, but headphone jack, nope, there's not an extra slot for that here. This entire side of the camera, aside from mic jack, is bare. So if you want to plug in headphones to monitor your audio, if you are, say, using a DJI Mic 2 wireless mic or a Rode Wireless Pro or any other microphone that's wireless for that matter, and you want to monitor your audio, sorry, you can't do that with the S9. Next, this camera does not have a hot shoe. Take this thing off here and all you see is a cold shoe, which means there's no electronic connection if you plug anything in here. And while you may think, well, that affects photographers more than videographers, right, Matt? Like, what am I going to be putting in here? I'm not putting a flash on. Well, I would agree with you if DJI had not recently released an adapter for Sony cameras that would enable you to plug in the DJI Mic 2 and then use the hot shoe to digitally transmit audio to the camera without needing to use a 3.5mm microphone cord. I love that feature. It's super cool. And so I would love to see something like that with Panasonic with the S9, but it's not possible because this camera does not have an electronic hot shoe mount. This is another area where I think they were able to save a bit of money by just using cold shoe, so you could still put a microphone on it, but cannot electronically connect it to the camera. Next for cons, and unfortunately this is a little bit worse. You may be looking over here on the side of the camera and thinking, oh, is that the SD card slot? Nope, that's a micro HDMI and a USB-C. If you want an SD card slot, you got to go down here to the bottom, and the SD card is kept in down here with the battery. And notice I said SD card, singular. Yes, unfortunately, this camera does not record to dual SD card slots. While I don't think this is a total deal breaker if you're going to use a camera in a professional setting, I really do prefer whenever camera manufacturers include dual card slots. And if you're someone that loves dual card slots and it's a total deal breaker for you if your camera does not include them, then you should probably know right off the bat the S9 only has one SD card slot. So yeah, may not be the camera for you. But let's get to the biggest enchilada now, and this is easily the biggest con of the S9, and in my opinion, this is one that is essentially a deal breaker if you film with a camera in a professional aspect in any sense. So if you film weddings, or if you film corporate or commercial interviews, or heck, even YouTube videos, anything like that, this is the deal breaker. And it is that the S9 unfortunately has a recording time limit. And I'm sure you may be thinking, Matt, you had a recording time limit with your old A7S II camera. That camera could only record for 30 minutes. How bad could the recording time limit on this camera be? Well, it's pretty bad. If you are recording in 4K, the camera has a 15-minute recording time limit. And if you're recording in 6K, the camera has a 10-minute recording time limit. And to be clear, this is not a rough time limit like you would see with older Canon cameras that could only record a 4 GB file, which meant that if your video got anywhere between 11 and like 13 minutes long, the camera would just suddenly stop recording and you'd have to go over and start the recording again. And also this recording limitation isn't anything like those older Sony cameras, which only had a 30-minute recording time limit, but the camera wouldn't tell you that. It would just hit 29:59 and then stop recording, so you'd have to run over and start it again. No, the S9 is actually way more honest about its recording time limit than either of those cameras, because if you switch this camera to video mode, in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you're going to see a timer appear. And that timer is either going to say 10 minutes if you're filming in 6K or 15 minutes if you're filming in 4K. And once that timer hits 0, the camera's going to stop recording. This is by far the biggest limitation of the S9, in my opinion, that prevents it from being able to be used by professional filmmakers, because unless you film elopements that are only 15 minutes or less in length, or you only film interviews that are less than 15 minutes. Imagine like a person's mid-speaking an interview and you're like, hey, by the way, can you just stop for a second? I gotta restart my camera recording. Can you say that line again? That would be really, really rough, right? You don't want to have to do that. So there's your deal breaker right there. The recording time limit for this camera sucks. Now I'm sure you may be wondering, Matt, why does this camera have this limitation? And to that I would say, that's why I'm so glad that I was able to fly all the way out to Japan for the launch of this camera, because I was actually able to confront some of these Panasonic employees face to face and be like, hey, why does this thing have this limitation? Which, dang, that's like such a clickable title, right? Like, I flew to Japan to confront the camera companies about overheating. Dang, that's very clickable. Okay, I don't think that I can run with that, but that's a good title idea. Anyways, I'm happy to tell you that Panasonic was very open with me about why this camera has this recording time limit, and the answer is pretty much exactly what I'm sure you could guess. See, it all comes down to heat. You put a full frame sensor in a compact camera body and enable it to record in 6K, and you're going to get a lot of heat generated, and it's going to be very easy for the camera to overheat relatively quickly. And if you are a company like Sony, you just slap a big warning label on the camera whenever you turn it on saying, hey, there's a high heat mode. Do you want to turn that on? The camera's going to get hot, but it'll help it not overheat, but eventually it'll probably overheat. You just warn people about that. And if you take the compact Sony a6700, for example, not a full frame camera, but very similar because it's a very compact camera. And whenever I tested that camera outside the heat of Texas, it didn't even last 20 minutes before it overheated. Welcome to Texas, right? Back to the S9 now, though. What I want you to remember above all is that Panasonic is a company that's really built a reputation around selling cameras that do not overheat when recording video. It's like a badge of honor, right? And this fact has been repeated to me many times over by Panasonic fanboys in my YouTube comments. Anytime I bring up any sort of overheating of a Sony camera, they're like, my GH5 doesn't overheat. You got by Panasonic, never overheats, bro. So Panasonic is really proud of this fact that their cameras do not overheat, and you can't really blame them for that. But what do you think is going to happen whenever you put a full frame sensor into a compact camera body like this without a fan to keep it cool, and then you enable it to film in 6K, and you know that really is a recipe for overheating. So what I think is that to avoid any chance of overheating, That's why Panasonic has such a strict, hard-coded in 10 or 15-minute recording time limit, because they do not want to risk the heat, in a word, as to their reputation as a company if they make cameras that do suddenly start overheating. Now, do I agree with this take? Do I agree putting in a hard limit so that way you can be like, guaranteed no overheating, see, no big deal? No, I don't agree with that. Of course not. Because even whenever I tested this, as well as other people that have been out here in Japan too, a lot of us tested the camera. We had it record for 10 minutes and then we pressed record again as soon as it finished and we're like, did it overheat? No, it's barely warm. Like, I think it could last for longer. It probably could go for 30 minutes without overheating. But I'll tell you what, I was also not testing this camera in the blazing heat of Texas. Japan is much cooler than Texas this time of year, and that may be more of an issue if I get to test this camera back in Texas. Hey, Matt here from the future in a different hotel room in Japan. It's much hotter today, and I just recorded an overheating test in my 69-degree hotel room with the camera in hot sunlight, where it was much warmer. And in this test recording in 6K open gate, where the camera has a 10-minute recording time limit, once it reached the end of that recording limit, I then immediately restarted the recording, and I was able to get the S9 to record for 25 minutes straight before it started flashing an overheat warning on the screen, and then approximately 5 minutes longer at 29 minutes and 50 seconds of total recording time, the camera finally overheated and it showed a screen that it was incapable of recording any video until it had cooled off. Now you have at least a rough idea of what you can expect in regards to how long this camera will last before it overheats. So here's my overall point. I can understand why Panasonic gave this camera a time limitation to prevent overheating, but at the same time, I really do wish that they gave us as filmmakers the opportunity to make this optional. Like, don't make it a hard-coded number. Let there be a setting where we can disable that and let the camera record longer with the knowledge, hey, it probably will overheat at some point. Put the risk into us as filmmakers and let us judge, hey, I'm in a pretty air-conditioned, cool room right now. It'll probably last for quite a while. That's how other camera manufacturers do it, and I think that I prefer that because this is such a short 10 to 15-minute time link. That's not very long at all. If you're mid-recording and you're not paying attention because something else is happening in the wedding ceremony, you got other cameras to check, 15 minutes is not a ton of time for you to run back over and be like, oh crap, is my camera still recording? Especially if you're getting distracted getting another angle. Or if someone's mid-interview, 15 minutes is not a long time for someone to be talking before you're like, hey, by the way, gotta run over and start the camera again. Hold on. It's just hard to do. 30 minutes would have been so much better in my opinion, and I really don't think many people would be complaining about it if it was 30 minutes because we're used to a lot of cameras having that. It's just whenever you get shorter than that, 15, 10 minutes, it's like, oh, this is not long at all. If you think that Panasonic should put this overheating risk in the hands of filmmakers and let them choose if they think the camera's going to overheat or not versus putting a hard-coded time limit on the camera, let me know that down in the comments because that'd be really interesting to see. So as you can see, the S9 is really a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you're getting what is essentially an S5 II sensor, which is very good in an ultra compact body that's only $1,500. But at the same time, Panasonic has had to make some pretty significant compromises to enable this camera to hit this price point. But like I said at the start of this video, there's now, in my opinion, a baseline level of features that new cameras need to offer if they want professionals to be able to use them. This baseline includes things like a headphone jack, dual card memory slots, a full-size HDMI port, a hot shoe, being capable of recording in 4K at higher frame rates and resolutions without a crop. And of course, above all, not having a hard-coded recording time limit. There are too many cameras out there that now hit all of these features. So it's really hard for me to recommend the S9 if you are a wedding filmmaker or a professional. That said, if you are brand new to filmmaking in general and you're not planning on filming anything that you're getting paid for, and instead you're just wanting a fun camera that's super compact that you can run around and film videos with, even in 6K open gate, which is kind of crazy, like I said, in a camera like this, at that point, I don't think the S9 is a bad choice for you. But for the majority of professional filmmakers out there, if you want a camera that's capable of filming a wedding or a corporate or commercial video, and you want a lot of these missing features that you're not seeing in the S9, and you don't want a recording time limit, well, in that case, I have good news for you. Panasonic has already made a camera, and it happens to use basically the same sensor as this one. It's called the S5 II, and at the time of recording this video, it's only a few $100 more, and I would buy that, and I think you're gonna be really happy with it. Speaking of being really happy, I did mention earlier that I have some LUTs that I've created that work fantastically with the S9, as well as the S5 II or any other Panasonic camera, especially the ones that film in vlog, which is, I think, all of them now. Yeah, my LUTs work fantastically with those cameras, and I would love for you to check them out at the link down in the video description. In addition, if you are a newer wedding filmmaker and you are considering getting into wedding filmmaking and making money doing it, and we're talking serious money, like thousands of dollars on the weekends, I want you to know that I've created a free workshop that you can watch right now. And this workshop is appropriately titled How to Book Your First Wedding in 30 Days or Less. This workshop is going to take you through all the steps that you need to take to book your first wedding easily. And heck, even if you've already filmed some weddings, it's still going to be really helpful to you with making future bookings. So I would love for you to check it out. Like I said, it's completely free and linked down in the video description. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.